DNA on that cigarette has been tied to crime scene evidence from the rape and murder of 18-year-old Angie Dodge.
In June 1996, 18-year-old Angie Dodge had just moved into her first apartment in Idaho Falls. She was full of hope, excited for her future. But everything changed one morning when Angie didn't show up for work.
Today, Idaho Falls police announcing they arrested this man, 53-year-old Brian Drips from Caldwell, in connection to that case.
A friend went to check on her and found a nightmare. Angie had been brutally murdered in her bedroom. The quiet town was shaken. No one could believe something so violent had happened to someone so young, so full of life. The crime scene shocks Idaho. When police entered Angie Dodge's apartment, they were met with a scene that was both heartbreaking and horrifying.
He was arrested last night in Canyon County and will be extradited to Bonneville County to face charges in Angie's death.
The room was in disarray. Blood stained the walls and floor. Angie's body was found in her bedroom, and the violence of the attack stunned even seasoned investigators. It was clear that this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Whoever did this had come there with dark intent. The crime scene team worked for hours, carefully collecting evidence. Among the most crucial pieces were strands of hair, fingerprints, and traces of semen left behind by the killer. It seemed like a solid start. With DNA evidence, police believed it was only a matter of time before they caught the person responsible. But time would prove that nothing about this case would be simple. The town of Idaho Falls, known for its close, knit community and quiet streets, was gripped with fear. Parents clutched their children closer. People locked their doors at night. News outlets repeated the story endlessly, a young woman murdered in her own bed, and no one knew who did it. The pressure on police grew with every passing day. The horror of Angie's death didn't just affect her family. It shook the entire town to its core. Everyone wanted answers. But as days turned into weeks, the fear turned into frustration. The killer was still out there, and no one felt safe anymore. Police chased early leads. In the early days of the investigation, police followed every possible lead. They questioned friends, neighbors, and anyone who had seen Angie in her final hours. Tips poured in, and the detectives were under pressure to solve the case quickly. Among those questioned was a young man named Chris Tapp, a friend of someone who knew Angie. Chris had no history of violence, but he was brought in for questioning anyway. Over the course of many hours, and multiple taped interviews, his story began to change. Detectives believed they had found their man. But there was a problem. His DNA didn't match the evidence from the scene. Still, investigators pressed on. They believed Chris knew more than he was saying. They kept questioning him, trying to connect him to the crime. As public fear grew, so did the urgency to make an arrest. And despite no physical proof linking Chris to the murder, the case began to focus on him more and more. Wrong man, wrong time. Chris Tapp was just 20 years old when he found himself at the center of a murder investigation. He had never met Angie Dodge, but after long hours of police questioning, he started to say things that detectives believed confirmed their theory. Chris was confused, scared, and desperate to cooperate. He wanted to go home. But he didn't know that each word he spoke was pulling him deeper into trouble. There was no physical evidence tying Chris to the crime. No fingerprints, no hair, and no DNA. But police believed his statements during the interviews were enough. Under intense pressure, Chris began to confess to details he couldn't have known. It would later come out that many of those details were fed to him by investigators. Despite serious concerns about how the confession was obtained, Chris Tapp was arrested and charged with Angie's murder. The case moved fast, and the town believed justice was finally being served. But behind closed doors, serious doubts were already forming. Chris Tapp's confession. Chris Tapp's confession became the heart of the case against him. Over the course of 7 videotaped interrogations, lasting more than 20 hours, Chris changed his story multiple times. He seemed unsure, often confused, and at times even repeated details only after police suggested them. Still, the confession was dramatic. It placed him at the scene and described the crime in chilling detail. But experts later reviewed the tapes and raised alarms. They said Chris had been manipulated, that he was coerced through fear, exhaustion, and the false promise of leniency. He had even been shown parts of the crime scene to help him remember. Despite these red flags, prosecutors pressed forward. At trial, the jury was shown the confession and convinced of his guilt. Chris Tapp was sentenced to life in prison. Angie's family, still grieving, believed they had seen justice. But the truth was far more complicated, and the real killer still walked free. Years of doubt and appeals. After his conviction, Christopher Tapp began a long, painful journey through the prison system. But outside the prison walls, questions about his guilt never truly went away. Journalists, legal experts, and advocates started reviewing the case. Many were shocked at what they found. No physical evidence tied Chris to the murder, and his confession was inconsistent and possibly coerced. One of the loudest voices was Carol Dodge, Angie's own mother. At first, she believed Chris was guilty. After all, he confessed. But over time, Carol studied the case herself. She watched the interrogation tapes and read the transcripts. What she saw changed her mind. She became convinced that Chris had been manipulated and that the real killer was still free. Her courage to speak out made a huge difference. For years, Chris and his legal team filed appeals. They argued that his confession was unreliable and that new DNA technology could finally prove the truth. But appeal after appeal was denied. It seemed the justice system was more interested in protecting the conviction than correcting a mistake. Even so, support grew. Documentaries and news reports shed light on the case. Legal organizations like the Idaho Innocence Project stepped in. Chris wasn't alone anymore, but it would still take nearly 2 decades, and a mother's relentless search for truth. Before the system was finally forced to listen, new DNA, new questions. By the early 2010s, advances in DNA testing brought new hope. Technology had improved so much that old evidence from the crime scene could now be examined in greater detail. The semen found on Angie Dodge's body, the strongest clue to her killer, was retested. Once again, it confirmed what Chris Tapp had said all along: it wasn't his. In fact, it didn't match anyone connected to the original case. This opened a door investigators could no longer ignore. If the DNA didn't match Chris or the men he had named, then who did it belong to? And why was Chris still in prison? Carol Dodge pushed even harder. She met with lawyers, scientists, and even law enforcement, urging them to take a deeper look. Eventually, with the help of the Idaho Innocence Project and new legal support, prosecutors agreed to re-evaluate the case. In 2017, after 20 years behind bars, Chris Tapp's rape conviction was vacated. He was released from prison, but the murder charge remained. He was technically still guilty in the eyes of the law. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. The mystery DNA profile was now being searched in national databases. There was finally a chance to find the person who left it. It was a race against time. But for the first time in years, the real path to justice was starting to appear. The real killer found. In 2019, a breakthrough finally came, thanks to a new tool, genetic genealogy. Investigators uploaded the unknown DNA profile from Angie Dodge's crime scene into a public database used by people researching family trees. Slowly the clues began to narrow. A match appeared, not a perfect one, but close enough to trace through family lines. With help from genealogists, police built a family tree that pointed to one man, Brian Drips. Brian Drips had lived across the street from Angie Dodge in 1996. At the time, he wasn't considered a suspect. He had quietly moved away shortly after the murder. But when detectives tracked him down and collected a cigarette he had discarded, the results were undeniable. His DNA matched the sample from the scene. When confronted, Drips confessed. He admitted to raping and killing Angie Dodge and said he acted alone. His calm confession shocked everyone. It was simple, clear, and heartbreaking. The truth had been there all along, hidden just steps away from Angie's home. For Christopher Tapp, this moment changed everything. With the real killer in custody, his name was finally cleared. In 2019, Chris was fully exonerated. After over 20 years of pain, the truth had emerged. But the victory came with a heavy cost: years stolen, a life lost, and a community forever changed. Justice and heartbreak. With Brian Drips behind bars and Christopher Tapp fully exonerated, the twisted case of Angie Dodge finally reached its resolution. But it was far from a happy ending. For Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, the moment was bittersweet. She had fought for years to uncover the truth, but the justice system had failed her daughter and sent an innocent man to prison. Chris Tapp had spent more than 20 years locked away for a crime he didn't commit. He lost his youth, his freedom, and the chance at a normal life. Though he was now free, no apology could return what had been taken. In court, he spoke with strength and grace, saying he forgave those who had wronged him. But the scars would never fully heal. Brian Drips pleaded guilty to the rape and murder of Angie Dodge and was sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom was filled with emotion, tears, relief, pain. After decades of mystery, the truth was known. But it came too late for justice to feel complete. This case changed lives, but it also changed laws. It raised serious questions about how police conduct interrogations, how confessions are treated, and how the justice system can sometimes get it terribly wrong. The story of Angie Dodge reminds us that seeking justice takes more than a verdict. It takes truth, courage, and time.